Brace yourself. Get it passed up anytime now. Collect yourself. Things will never be the same in that sad world. Around a lot a bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million missing pieces. When I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So sit back in your hole.
Good morning, everybody. Good to be with you today at long last. Oh, gosh, President, you bring my when if it's finished, when it's finished. It is. So today we finally dive into Arthurian literature. When I say brief this time, I do mean brief. This will be a brief note before we dive into the text about how we're going to do this, because there are many different ways to cover Arthurian literature. We're going to be looking at, before it's all said and done, we're going to be looking at over 20 different pieces of literature. And so many times if a class covers this material, one sensible way to do it is in order of publication. So we see what were they saying about Arthur in the 11th century, and then in the 12th, and 13th, 14th. It can be done topically, where you compare and contrast how different authors cover different characters and cover different topics. Because what there's not really a canon for the Arthur story. It's a lot like Greek mythology in that way. There's no one official version of any of these stories. But just like Greek mythology does have Homer and Hesiod, which is the closest you're going to get to a canon, Arthur has Geoffrey of Monmouth and Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, and those are as close as you're going to get to the official story. But every author throughout the Middle Ages and on into modern times who covers the Arthur story has to make decisions. What stories am I going to tell? What am I going to leave out? What am I going to expand and embellish? In what order? Sometimes different events happen in different orders in different authors. So the way I decided to approach this was to approach it as if I were one of these Arthurian authors. We'll be excerpting the texts of other authors, but my aim is to tell a consistent story from start to finish, pieced together from the different sources. So we won't really be looking at here multiple versions of the same event, things like that. I want to, as best as possible, tell a consistent story with the beginning, middle, and end. And we are at the beginning of the story with this reading from Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. When we come in, we want to probably imagine this being the late 300s. So it's the end, or it's late in the period of Roman rule in Britain, but we're still under Roman rule in Britain. A man named Gracianus seized hold of the royal crown of Britain and made himself king. Then he began to exercise such tyranny over the people that the plebs, that's a Roman term for common people, that the plebs banded together to attack him and eventually assassinate him. As soon as the death of Gracianus became common knowledge throughout the other kingdoms, Saxon barbarians who had been hiding in Ireland came and brought with them the Scots, Norwegians, and Danes. These people ravaged the kingdom with sword and fire from seacoast to seacoast. As a result of this most cruel oppression and devastation, messengers were sent to carry letters to Rome. They begged with tears and supplication that an armed force should come to avenge them, and they promised perpetual subjection if only their enemies could be driven far away. A legion which had played no part in the earlier disaster was immediately put under their command. Once this legion had been shipped across the ocean to the country, it met the enemy in hand-to-hand conflict. The Romans eventually slew a great number of the enemy and drove all who remained out of the territory. As soon as the legion had freed the prostrate people from this fearful maltreatment, the population was ordered to construct a wall from one sea to the other to divide Albany from Deira. This wall was erected by a great crowd of workmen, as a deterrent which should hold off their enemies and as a real protection for the inhabitants of the country. Albany had been completely devastated by the barbarians who had landed there, for when hostile people came, they looked upon that country as a convenient lurking place. The local inhabitants therefore pressed on with the work and finished their wall, using private funds and public ones which they had collected. The Romans announced to the country of Britain that they could no longer be troubled with such wearisome expectations, and that they considered it an insult to Rome that a large army of this type should be importuned on land and sea for the sake of a cowardly pack of vagabond freebooters. The Britons ought instead to develop the habit of relying upon their own armed power. We're linked here to a real historical event. The year is 401, and the Emperor Honorius, the child emperor, has said, "Britain, you're on your own," and pulled all the Romans out. And the Britons, should fend for themselves. Caden, turn the TV on for me, please. To fend for themselves. I can't read anymore. No, I can't ever. Was never able to. The Britons, they should themselves defend their country, their property, their wives, and their children. And what is greater than these, their own liberty and their very lives. This by fighting manfully with all their strength. In order to give themselves an opportunity of delivering this warning in full public, the Romans ordered all men of military age in the island to assemble in London, for they themselves were making ready to return to Rome. When everyone had come together, Guithalinus, the Archbishop of London, was ordered to speak. That's you, Miles. He made the following speech to them. You'd rise, be Archbishop. Come up front. Show your archiepiscopal dignity. That's the other form of archiepiscopal.
When at the command of the princes who stand around me, I am forced to address you. I feel more like bursting into tears than embarking upon a lofty discourse. I am greatly saddened by the state of deprivation and abjectness which has overtaken you, since Maximus stripped this kingdom of all its army and all its young men. You are simply the last remnants left, common people, ignorant of the ways of war, men who were busied in other matters, some in cultivating their fields, for example, others in the various makeshifts of business life. When hostile men of other nations came to attack you, they forced you to abandon your sheepfolds, just as if you yourselves had been sheep wandering about without a shepherd. Then the might of Rome restored you to your possessions. Surely you will not always put your trust in being protected by someone else. Won't you accustom your hands to brandish shields, swords, and spears against those who would be no mightier than you yourselves? If only you could throw off your laziness and your lethargy. The Romans are tired of all this perpetual traveling about, which they had to do in order to fight your enemies for you. They now elect to forego all the tribute which you pay, rather than be harassed any longer in this way on sea and land. Given that you were only ordinary folk in the days when you possessed soldiers, do you think that for this reason you have lost all claim to manhood? Surely man can be born out of their social case. A soldier from a farmer, for example, or a farmer from a soldier. Surely a military man can be the son of a shopkeeper, or, for that matter, a shopkeeper the son of a military man. Given the possibility of one case being born from another, I find it hard to believe that people are such that they can actually lose their manhood. If you are men, then behave like men. Pray to Christ to give you courage and then protect your own liberty.
When he stopped talking, the crowd applauded him so loudly that you would have said that there and then they were inspired with courage. Next, the Romans gave the pusillanimous Britons some firm advice. They left behind them, I think the great Archbishop can have a seat. They left behind them models showing how weapons should be constructed. And they recommended that towers should be built overlooking the water at intervals along the sea coast and the southern shore. That was supposed to be you, Miles. I just didn't put you on the screen. Where the Britons kept their shipping, for it was there that barbarian attacks were most to be feared. However, it is easier for a kite to be made to act like a sparrowhawk than for a wise man to be fashioned at such short notice from a peasant. He who offers any depth of wisdom to such a person is acting as though he were throwing a pearl among swine. The moment the Romans said goodbye and went away, apparently never to return, the enemies whom I have mentioned reappeared once more from the ships in which they had sailed off to Ireland. They brought with them other companies of Scots and Picts, with Norwegians, Danes, and all the rest whom they had under command, and seized the whole of Albany up into the wall. Once the departure of those who had supported the Britons became known, and the fact that they had sworn never to return, the invaders pressed on even more confidently than before with their devastation of the island. In opposition to them, slow-witted peasants were posted on top of the walls, men useless in battle, who were unable even to run away for the very palpitation of their bellies, and who shook with fear through the days and nights on top of their stupid perches. Meanwhile, the enemy continued to ply their hooked weapons, dragging the miserable plebs down from the walls with them, so that they were dashed to the ground. The very suddenness of the death they endured was a stroke of luck to those who were killed in this way, for by their immediate execution they avoided the miserable torments which awaited their brothers and their children. Constantine, brother of, so this is not the great Emperor Constantine, who would have lived more than 100 years earlier, but Geoffrey does present him as a descendant of that emperor. Constantine, brother of the king of Amorica. Amorica is another name for Brittany. And Brittany is a region of France that to this day is populated by Britons, by Celtic Britons who came there 2,000 years ago from Britain. So Constantine, king of Amorica, that is Brittany, the Britain-populated region in northern France, becomes high king of the Britons, but is assassinated. The king has 3 sons. Well, I'm summarizing a little bit. Yeah. The king had 3 sons: Constans, who was a monk, Aurelius Ambrosius, and Uther Pendragon. As soon as Constantine was dead, a disagreement arose among the leaders as to who should be raised to the throne. Some were in favor of Aurelius Ambrosius, others of Uther Pendragon, and still others of various close relatives of the royal family. Finally, while they were arguing for this claimant and that, there came on the scene Vortigern, leader of the Geoffrey, who was himself busy making every possible effort to lay hands on the crown. You're slimy. You're very slimy in this story. Very slimy. Not awesome. No, slimy. I wouldn't say awesome. I'd say slimy. He paid a visit. He paid a visit to the monk Constans. So Brad Maggot is Constans, and Tyler is the slimy Vortigern.
As you know, your father is dead, and your brothers cannot be made king because of their youth. I cannot think of anyone else in your family whom the people would promote to the kingship. If you'll only agree to my plan and increase my own personal fortune, then I will persuade the people to accept the idea of extricating you from your religious order, seeing that it stands in the way of such a rank, and then of raising you to the throne.
When Constans heard this, he was greatly pleased, and he promised on oath that he would do for slimy Vortigern whatever the latter asked. Slimy Vortigern then took charge of Constans, dressed him up in royal garments, and led him off to London. There, slimy Vortigern made Constans king, although hardly with the people's approval. Archbishop, Miles, brace yourself. Archbishop Guthalinus was dead by this time. You die off screen. You just somewhere in the middle you die. No one else was present who dared to anoint Constans, seeing that he was giving up his position as a monk. However, that did not make him take off the crown again when slimy Vortigern himself, assuming the duties of a bishop, placed it on his head with his own hands. Once Constans had been crowned in this way, he handed the entire government of the kingdom over to slimy Vortigern. He accepted slimy Vortigern's advice without question, never taking any action himself until slimy Vortigern had told him to do so. It was his own lack of character. You're not that great either, Constans. It was his own lack of character which made him act in this way, plus the fact that he had learned that what he had learned in the cloister had nothing to do with how to rule the kingdom. Slimy Vortigern was so encouraged by this that he began to plan in his heart how he could make himself king. That was what he had coveted above all things for a long time. And now he saw that the moment was coming when his desire could easily be achieved. The whole kingdom had been placed under his own control, and Constans, who was called king, stood there as a mere shadow of a leader. To his own subjects, he appeared as a man totally lacking in severity and judicial authority, and he inspired no fear in the neighboring peoples. His two brothers, Uther Pendragon and Aurelius Ambrosius, still lay in their cradles and could hardly be raised to the kingship. A further accident had happened in that the older leaders of the kingdom had died off, and so Slimy Vortigern seemed the only man available who was wise and astute, with advice to offer that was worth anything at all. Almost all the others were boys or young men who had come into their honors by some chance or other when their fathers and uncles had been killed off in the recent fighting. Slimy Vortigern fully understood all this. He was busy meditating how he could most safely and cunningly depose the monk Constans and force his own way into the latter's position. He decided to defer this until he had first of all subjected the various tribes to his own rule and given them a chance to become used to him. He began to transfer the royal treasure away from Constans to his own keeping, and the cities too with their garrisons, saying that a rumor was going around that the men of the neighboring islands were planning an attack. Once he'd achieved this, he stationed his own supporters there. It's real slimy. Once he'd achieved this, he stationed his own supporters. I don't know how you got supporters. You're slimy. Once he'd achieved this, if I could please continue. Once he'd achieved this, he stationed his own supporters there to hold these cities in allegiance to him. Still plotting the treason which he had in his heart, he next went to Constans and told him that it was necessary for the establishment of his own household to be increased, so that he could face in greater safety the enemies who were about to attack him.
Have I not put everything under your command? Do whatever you want to, provided only that men remain their ultimate fidelity to me.
It has been reported to me that the Picts intend to lead the Danes and the Norwegians against us in an attempt to do us the greatest possible harm. I therefore advise, and this I consider to be the safest course, that you should keep certain of the Picts in your own court, to act as liaison officers between you and the rest of their nation. If it is true that the Picts have already begun to prepare war, then these men will spy out for you the secret weapons and the battle plans of their own nationals, which you can then avoid all the more easily.
Let me join me up here, the great King Constans and the savage Picts. In this, you can see the hidden treachery of a secret enemy. Slimy Vortigern was advising this not in order to ensure the safety of Constans, but because he knew that the Picts were a shifty people. I almost misread that. Were a shifty people, ready for any mean trick. When they were drunk, or something had made them happy, or something had made them angry, I did misread that one. When they were drunk or something that made them angry, they could easily be stirred up against the king and so murder him out of hand. If this were to happen, then Slimy Vortigern would have the opportunity to make himself a king, as he had so often planned to do. He therefore sent messengers to Scotland to invite 100 Pictish soldiers to come, and these he introduced into the king's retinue. Once they had arrived, he honored them above all the other men and enriched them with all sorts of bribes. He fattened them up so much on food and drink that they accepted him, Slimy Vortigern, as their king. They used to wander through the streets, shouting his praises and bellowing,
"Is it Vortigern who ought to be king? Vortigern is worthy of sceptre of Britain. Constans is not worthy of it."
At this, Vortigern would try to give them more and more so that he might seem even more attractive to them. When he had won over the Picts completely, Vortigern made them drunk and then pretended that he wanted to leave Britain so that he could acquire greater wealth. He gave it out that the little he had would not possibly suffice for him to pay the wages of even 50 soldiers. Then he went home, apparently greatly downcast, and left them drinking in the hall. When they saw this, the Picts were more depressed than one can imagine, for they thought that what he had said was true. They grumbled among themselves.
Why do we let this man go on limit? Why do we add? Why don't we kill him so Vortigern can take over the royal throne? Who else in the kingdom could possibly succeed Constance? Vortigern is a man who ought to be ruled. He ought to be honored and granted very dignity, for there is no limit to be rewarded, which he gave us.
Ooh, now here comes the fun part. Without more ado, they burst into the king's bedroom, and there they attacked Constance and killed him. They carried his head of slimy Vortigern. When he saw it, he burst into tears, as if the sight had saddened him, although he had really never been so happy in his life before. He called the citizens of London together, for it was in that city that this happened. He ordered the traitors to be bound and to have their heads cut off. Double cross, Angelica, you've got your head cut off too. While they were still tied up. This for having dared to commit so dastardly a crime. There were some who thought that this treasonable act had really been planned by slimy Vortigern, and that the Picts would never have undertaken such a deed without his consent. Others, however, had no hesitation in acquitting him of such a crime. The matter was never cleared up. However, those in charge of the upbringing of the two brothers, Aurelius Ambrosius and Uther Pendragon, fled with their charges to Little Britain. That's Brittany in France, just in case the two should be murdered by slimy Vortigern. King Boudicca received them and brought them up with due honor. As soon as Vortigern realized that there was now no one at all in the realm who was his equal, he set the kingly crown upon his own scumbag head and assumed precedence over his fellow princes. Sometime later, his treason became known. The peoples of the neighboring islands, whom the Picts had brought over into Albany, revolted against him. The Picts themselves were incensed because their comrades in arms had been executed on account of Constance, and they kept doing their utmost to take revenge on slimy Vortigern. As day followed day, the slimy king was therefore much concerned to see the casualties of his army in battle. What is more, he was haunted by the fear of Aurelius Ambrosius and his brother Uther Pendragon, who, as explained already, had fled to Little Britain because of him. His ears were filled with a constantly repeated description of how they had come to man's estate and were planning to launch an enormous fleet against his kingdom, which really belonged to them. About this time, there landed in certain parts of Kent 3 vessels of the type which we call longships. They were full of armed warriors, and there were 2 brothers named Hengist and Horsa in command of them. At that moment, slimy Vortigern was at Duroburnia, which is now called Canterbury, for it was his custom to visit that city very frequently. When messengers reported to him that unknown men, hey, you want to take over as narrator?
Sure.
Yeah, come on up here. Just
You got tired.
I did. I got very tired. In the middle of the next page, I'll turn it over to you. At that moment, Vortigern was at Canterbury when messengers reported to him that unknown men, and what is more, men of huge stature, had landed in enormous ships. Vortigern made peaceful overtures to them and ordered them to be led into his presence. As soon as they were brought in, he fixed his eyes on the 2 brothers, for they stood out among the others because of their noble bearing and good looks. Vortigern examined all the others and asked what country they had traveled from and why they had come to our land over which he ruled. Hengst started to reply for the others, for his great maturity and his good sense made him their natural leader. I guess I didn't cast Hengst. Most noble of all kings, he said, Saxony is our homeland, one of the provinces of Germany. The cause of our coming is that we wish to offer our services to you or to some other prince. We have been banished from our own country on the simple pretext that the tradition of that kingdom demanded such action. For in our homeland it is the custom that whenever there occurs a surplus population of men, the leaders of the different provinces meet together and order the young men of the entire realm to gather before them. Then they cast lots and so pick out the most able and the strongest, who must journey off to foreign lands and seek a living for themselves. That is done so that the country in which they have been born may be freed of its surplus manpower. It has happened recently that in our own country the supply of men has become too great. Our leaders met to cast lots. They chose these young men whom you see in your presence and ordered them to obey the tradition handed down from ancient time. They elected us two brothers as their leaders, simply because we came from the ruling family. Myself, who bear the name of Hengst, and this man who is called Horsa. We duly obeyed the decrees whose authority is sanctioned by their antiquity. We put to sea with only Mercury to guide us, and we journeyed to your kingdom.
When he heard the name Mercury mentioned, the king looked them full in the face and asked them what their religion was.
I guess I'll just be
Here.
Okay. Saturn, Jove, and the others who rule the world, and more especially Mercury, whom in our language we call Woden. Our ancestors dedicated the fourth day of the week to him, and down to our time that day is called Wednesday from his name. Next after him we worship the goddess who is the most powerful of them all, Freya by name, to whom they dedicated the sixth day, after her we call Friday.
I am greatly grieved by your belief, which indeed can better be called unbelief. But all the same, I am delighted that you have come. For either God himself or someone else has brought you here to help me at most convenient moment. My enemies harass me on every side, and if you share with me the hardship of my battles, then I will welcome you with all honor into my kingdom, and enrich you with gifts of all sorts and with grants of land.
The barbarians agreed to this without more ado. A treaty was made between them, and it took up residence in the palace itself. The Saxons helped Vortigern defeat Picts and other enemies. The king rewarded them with large land holdings and urged them to invite more Saxons into Britain.
Can you make out the next one?
Vortigern fell in love with and married Hengist's daughter, Renwine. Many Britons are opposed to this, and Vortigern's son Vortimer leads a rebellion. Renwine poisons Vortimer, and Vortigern restored to the throne.
That was my son. You can tell it's mine because I spelled fell in love Fe3LL, no space IN.
Yeah, the old dude would have written that. I gotta remember to do that. Hengist brooded over the various lines of action he could adopt, and finally chose one of them. This was to approach the people of Britain as he thought, as though his intentions were peaceful, and then to betray them. With this end in view, Hengist sent messengers to the king, ordering them to tell Vortigern that he had not brought this vast horde of men with him so that they could settle in the kingdom with him, or so that with their help he could do violence to the country. The reason why he had brought them was that he had thought that Vortimer was still alive. It was Vortimer whom he intended to resist, should that the king have attempted to oppose him. Now that he was quite clear that Vortimer was dead, Hengist placed himself and his men at the disposition of Vortigern. From this vast force the king should retain in his realm as many as he wished, and all those whom he wanted to dismiss should, with the full agreement of Hengist, return to Germany. If all this seemed acceptable to Vortigern, then Hengist asked him to name a day and a place where they might meet together, so that he, Hengist, could arrange everything in accordance with the king's wishes. When all this was announced to the king, it pleased him immensely, for the last thing he wanted was for Hengist to leave. After long debate, he ordered the Britons and the Saxons to assemble at the cloister of Ambries on the first day of May, which was coming soon, so that there these matters might be settled. This was agreed to on both sides. Hengist then thought out a new method of betrayal. He ordered each of his soldiers to conceal a large dagger inside his boot. At some moment when, in apparent security, the Britons were discussing the subject at hand, Hengist himself would give his men the signal, Nimet ora Saxus. Each of them should then be ready to attack boldly the Briton standing beside him. In short, each should draw his dagger and without a moment of hesitation cut his companion's throat. The appointed day soon came. They all gathered together in the neighborhood which had been chosen, and the peace conference duly began. When Hengist saw that a suitable moment had come for his act of treachery, he bellowed out,
This is me, isn't it? Nimet ure Saxus!
He himself immediately seized hold of Vortigern and held them tight by his royal robe. The moment they heard the signal, the Saxons drew their daggers, attacked the leader standing near them, and cut the throats of about 460 counts and earls, who were thinking of something quite different. Afterwards, the holy Eldadus buried the corpses and said the last rites over them according to the custom of the Christian church. This not far from Caer Caraduk, which is now called Salisbury, in the cemetery beside the cloister of Ambries, who had founded it there himself many years before. The Britons had all come there unarmed, thinking of nothing but the peace conference. The result was that the Saxons, who for their part had come there thinking of nothing but treachery, were able to kill them the more easily, unarmed as they were. However, the pagans did not achieve their objective without loss, for many of them were slain as they tried to kill their enemies. The Britons picked up stones and sticks from the ground and struck down their betrayers in self-defense. A certain Count of Gloucester, called Eldol, was among those present. The moment he saw this act of treachery, he seized a wooden stake which he had found by chance, and proceeded to defend himself with it. He broke the limbs of anyone within reach whom he could hit with the piece of wood, dispatching him forthwith to hell. He shattered skulls, arms, shoulder blades, and even legs, causing the greatest possible terror, and before he left the spot, he had killed 70 men with the stake which he held. He could not resist so vast a force for so long, but got away and sought refuge in his own city. Many were killed on both sides, but the Saxons had the upper hand, for the Britons, who had not expected anything of the sort to happen, had come unarmed and had little chance of offering resistance. The Saxons had intended to kill Vortigern, so that they might complete the evil task which they had begun. But instead, they bound him tight and threatened him with death, demanding his cities and his fortresses in exchange for his life. Vortigern immediately...
It's pronounced slimy Vortigern.
Slime-tastic Vortigern immediately concealed everything that they demanded, given only that he might be allowed to escape alive. When everything had been promised them on oath, the Saxons freed them from his chains. They went first to London and captured the city. Next they took York, Lincoln, and Winchester, ravaging the neighboring countryside and attacking the peasantry, just as wolves attack sheep which the shepherds have forsaken. When Vortigern saw this horrible devastation, he fled to certain parts of Wales, not knowing what he could do against his accursed people. In the end, Vortigern summoned his magicians, asked them for their opinion, and ordered them to tell him what to do. They all gave him the same advice, that he should build for himself an immensely strong tower, into which he could retreat in safety if he should lose all other fortresses. He surveyed a great number of places, and attempted to find a site suitable for this, and in the end he came to Mount Erith. There he assembled stonemasons from different parts of the country and offered them to build a tower for him. The masons gathered and began to lay the foundations of their tower. However much they built one day, the earth swallowed up the next, in such a way that they had no idea where their work had vanished to.
That's a bad problem to have in the construction industry. Every time you build something overnight, the earth eats it.
Rather inconvenient. When this was announced to Vortigern, he consulted his magicians the second time, to give them a chance of explaining the reason for it. They told him that he should look for a lad without a father, and that when he had found one, he should kill him, so that the mortar and stone could be sprinkled with the lad's blood. According to them, the result of this would be that the foundations would hold firm.
Okay, so I need 2 volunteers to be 2 kids.
We need lads.
Okay, Caden and need somebody. Man Blanco, get up here. Okay, so Caden, you're going to be the kid named Dina Budius, and Amanda Blanco, you'll be the other kid. He'll be named. He'll be named in like 3 lines. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Messengers were immediately sent out through the different parts of the country to find such a person if they could. They came to a town which was afterwards called Caermerdine, and there they saw some lads playing by the town gate. They went to look at the game. Tired by their journey, they sat down in a circle, still hoping to find what they were seeking. At last, when much of the day had passed, a sudden quarrel broke out between 2 of the lads, whose names were Merlin and Dina Bucius. As they argued, Dina Bucius said to Merlin,
Back for the kid.
Why do you try to compete with me, fathead? How can we two be equal in skill? I myself am of royal blood on both sides of my family. As for you, nobody knows who you are, for you never have had a father.
At this word, the messengers looked up. They examined Merlin closely and asked the standers-by who he was. Satisfied that Merlin is the fatherless child to be sacrificed, they bring him to Vortigern, and Merlin asked,
"Why have my mother and I been brought into your presence?
Yeah. do everything around here. Slime.
All you do
You're
is listen,
slime. Look, you're trying to sacrifice a child to build a building. You're slime. You are slimy.
My magicians have advised me that I should look for a fatherless child, so that my buildings can be sprinkled with his blood and thus stand firm.
Tell your magicians to appear in front of me, and I will prove that they have lied.
The king was amazed at what Merlin said. He ordered the magicians to come immediately and sit down in front of Merlin.
Just because you do not know what is obstructing the foundations of the tower which these men have begun, you have recommended that my blood should be sprinkled on the mortar to make the building stand firm. Tell me then, what lies hidden under the foundation? There is certainly something there which is preventing it from holding firm.
The magician.
Mike's back. The Mike's backphone is what I said, but I meant backwards.
The backbone? The magicians, who were terrified, said nothing. Merlin, who was also called Ambrosius, then went on.
My lord king, summon your workmen, order them to dig in the earth, and underneath you will find a pool. That is what is preventing the tower from standing.
This was done. A pool was duly found of any fear, and it was this which made the ground unsteady. Merlin went up to the magician the second time and said,
Tell me now, you lying flatterers, what lies beneath the pool?
Second. So the rest of today's reading, and we're close to the end here. The rest of today's reading is taken from a contemporary source, the author John Matthews' story Merlin and the Dragons. Though that story is a straightforward adaptation of Geoffrey of Monmouth combined with the historian Dennis.
They remained silent, unable to utter a single sound.
Oh, did I cut you off too early? I'm sorry.
Close up.
No.
Order the pool.
Oh, order the pool to be drained. Oh, and at the bottom you will observe two hollow stones. Inside the stones you will see two dragons which are sleeping.
It's used to
One is red, the other white. They have slept and woken many times since they were placed there. Often when they wake, they struggle with one another, for they are ancient enemies. For this time, the red dragon represents the British, and the white the Saxons, you invited to this land. Lord Vortigern, their struggle causes the stones and timbers of the tower to be stuck beneath the earth.
Vortigern shifted uneasily in his chair, but he nodded, and several of his strongest men came forward, and with great labor and many fearful looks, lifted the lid of the stone box. At first, there was only darkness within. Then the darkness itself began to move and turn from within it, and unfolded the two servants of which Merlin had foretold. Glad for their freedom, they flew up into the sky, and hot fires were in their breaths. The shadow of their wings covered the land in darkness. Vortigern and his advisors and soldiers and artificers turned pale and covered their heads, as if expecting such fire to rain down upon them. But the serpents fell upon each other with such a great hissing and crying, with great reeking gusts of flame, that all those who watched forgot their fear and gaped at the struggle with wide eyes. For a long time, neither beast had the advantage, raging across the sky with screams of rage. But at length the white serpent began to drive off the red, giving it many deep wounds with claw and flame. Then suddenly the red serpent drew upon its innermost fires and struck back, rising higher in the air and falling upon the back of the white and biting its neck. Locked together, the serpents fell to the earth, striking it with the force of their great bodies. Smoke roiled about them and then ebbed. As the air grew clear, the watchers dared approach. And at once the red serpent raised itself and flew into the sky with a great screech of victory. Circling the hill once, it then flew off to the north and was seen no longer. Behind it on the hillside, the body of the white serpent lay still, its neck torn open by the red, its hot blood scorching the earth beneath it until, it is said, nothing grew there again. Silence fell. Vortigern sat still in his chair, his eyes still reflecting the light of the battle. His advisors had already turned their backs and were making a quick descent from the hilltop. Merlin stood alone, his eyes upon the king.
Now you have seen how these things will end. The red serpent will defeat and destroy the white. The Britons will overcome the Saxons and take back their lands.
As he spoke, there was a light around him that had not been there before, and where before they had seen a child, now they saw a man of power, whom none dared approach.
Build your tower, Vortigern, though it will not save you.
Then it was that Merlin spoke at length and gave forth many of his greatest prophecies. It is said that he wept as he did so, for the dark times that were to come. I've heard that Master Geoffrey of Monmouth collected these sayings later and set them in a book, but this I have not seen, so I cannot include them here. What I've heard is that the youth spoke of many things until the end of time itself, and that he foretold not only Vortigern's death, but the coming of the great king. Many could not listen to his words, but covered their ears and fled away from there. Vortigern himself turned pale, for he knew that his time was growing short, and that he would never again rule over the lands of Britain. And so it was, for the sons of the usurped King Constans, Ambrosius and Uther, brought their army to Britain and fought against the Saxons until Hengist and his kin were slain, and the invaders driven out of these lands. And in the end, the brothers came to the hill where the strong tower stood tall above the valley, where Vortigern had caused it to be built in spite of Merlin's words. There, the brothers caused fire to be lit around it so that it was consumed, and with it, the tyrant himself, along with his Saxon wife, just as the youth had foretold.
That's you dying, Tyler. That's you dying right there. Right there. So, thank you to our leaders. Tomorrow we will, I forgot what order I do the next two stories. Oh yes, so tomorrow we'll find out just who is this punk kid Merlin. That's all I need from you for today. Rest of the time is yours.
Walk around the light a bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million missing pieces. When I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So sit back in your hole, or get back in your cave. If I'm going down, I'm taking someone with me.